My son threw a BBQ party to celebrate kicking me out of the house. When I pulled into the driveway, a massive banner covered the garage. "Goodbye, freeloader, don't come back." The neighbors laughed, throwing food at my car like it was entertainment. And my son stood by the grill, raising his beer like he had just won. I said nothing, just took a photo, and left. 2 days later, he called me in a panic. "Welcome to today's story. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel." This is a fictional story, created with dramatized details to offer a meaningful and thought-provoking experience for viewers worldwide today. My name is Conrad Rhodes. I am 62 years old, and as a retired logistics manager who spent 40 years timing freight, I should have seen the collision coming. In my line of work, you learn that every disaster leaves a trail of data points long before the impact. You see the late shipping manifest, the grinding of the gears, the shifting of the weight in the trailer. But when the weight is your own family, you tend to ignore the sensors. You tell yourself, the screeching sound is just the wind. I pulled my sedan into the driveway of the house I had painstakingly maintained for 3 decades, expecting the familiar sights of a family celebration. It was September 2024, a Saturday afternoon, meant for my granddaughter Marigold's 6th birthday. I had a gift in the passenger seat and a heart full of the quiet patience that had become my primary survival skill in this household. But as the nose of my car cleared the sidewalk, the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Stretched across the garage door, anchored by professional-grade grommets, was a giant vinyl banner. The red block letters were screamers designed to be read from 3 houses down. It did not say happy birthday. It said, "Goodbye, freeloader. Don't come back." The contrast was a jagged edge. Country music was blasting from outdoor speakers, something upbeat and celebratory that felt like a mockery of the oxygen leaving my lungs. The smell of overcooked burgers drifted on the humid Michigan air, and for a second, I couldn't move my hands from the steering wheel. I was staring at the supreme irony of that banner. My son, Beckett Rhodes, a 35-year-old tech entrepreneur who traded his integrity for a venture capital aesthetic, was the one who had invited the neighborhood to witness this. He stood by the grill, a spatula in one hand and a beer in the other, wearing a smirk that cost me more than he will ever know. Take a look at that banner in your mind. Imagine the grommet screaming under the tension of a lie. The sheer theatricality of it was what staggered me first. This wasn't a private argument or a heated conversation in the kitchen. This was a grand opening for my social execution. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of dry straw. The neighborhood elite people I had shared fence-line chats with for years were gathered on the lawn with craft beers and wine coolers. They looked at me, then at the banner, then back at me. Some whispered behind their hands. Others offered that tight, thin-lipped, pitying look that suburbanites use when they think they are witnessing a righteous intervention. Leanie Rhodes. My 33-year-old daughter-in-law adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked at me like I was a stain on her perfectly curated backyard. She was the director of this performance, I could tell, by the way she checked the crowd's reaction. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the concrete I had power washed just last month. "We are doing this because we love you enough to stop enabling you, Conrad." She said, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to catch every syllable. "It is time to be a man, even if it is 30 years too late." Beckett laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that he tried to mask with a swig of beer. "Did you think we would just keep paying for your air forever? Dad!" he shouted. The crowd chuckled, a low, collective vibration that made the metallic taste of bile rise in my throat. In families like mine, visibility is morality. If they cannot see you sweat, your work doesn't exist. They saw a 62-year-old man who sat at a laptop in his room. They didn't see the silent transfers. They didn't see the foundation holding the roof over their heads. They only saw the story Leanie had spent months carefully weaving into the neighborhood gossip mill. Vaughn Redmond, Leanie's 58-year-old father, was already 3 beers deep, swinging a spatula like a scepter over a grill I had paid for. He took a long draw of his drink and pointed at me. "Look who finally came to claim his junk," he bellowed, his face flushed with the kind of courage only a free bar provides. "Go find a shelter that takes consultants who don't have clients, Conrad." Someone from the lawn threw something. It was a hot dog still steaming that bounced off the hood of my car and left a smear of mustard. The laughter peaked, then a roar of approval from people who believed they were helping a young couple rid themselves of a parasite. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer velocity of the betrayal. I looked up at the house, the one I had provided the down payment for 10 years ago, to ensure my son had a start in life. I looked at the windows I'd replaced and the roof I'd shingled. How much is a man's silence worth when his own blood starts selling tickets to his downfall? I caught a glimpse of Marigold Rhodes, my 6-year-old granddaughter, standing in her pink birthday dress at the living room window. Her face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and wet with a confusion that mirrored my own. She didn't understand why the party looked like a funeral. My heart, which I thought had hardened into a knot of logistics and data, cracked for her. But then my gaze shifted to the edge of the patio, and the world slowed down. Standing among the neighbors holding a bottle of Beckett's beer and laughing at a joke Vaughn had just made was a man I recognized instantly. It was my personal banker, the man who handled my private real estate holdings and knew the exact decimal point of my net worth. He was supposed to be my vault keeper, the one person who knew I was the furthest thing from a freeloader. Seeing him there drinking with the people who were currently stoning me with grocery store meat changed the temperature of my blood. I looked at Beckett then, at the banner, and finally at the banker, and realized the leak in my life was deeper than I ever imagined. Have you ever wondered how long a person can live inside a story that isn't true before the walls start to feel real? Standing there in my own driveway, watching my personal banker laugh with the people trying to bury my reputation, I realized that the leak in my life was deeper than I ever imagined. The man who saw the millions in my accounts every morning was clinking glasses with the son who was currently stoning me with red block letters and hot dog grease. It was a staggering revelation, a systemic failure of my own design. I had spent 40 years managing logistics, ensuring that every pallet and every freight container reached its destination with surgical precision. I knew how to secure a perimeter. I knew how to hide a surplus. But as I stood paralyzed under that banner, I understood that I had built a vault so secure that I'd accidentally locked myself on the outside. The version of reality my son Beckett and his wife Leanie had sold to the neighborhood was a masterpiece of suburban theater. It was simple, clean, and humiliating in that specific way people love, because it allows them to feel superior while holding a wine cooler. In their script, I was the broken man, a widower, who had let grief turn his brain to mush, a financial anchor, dragging down a young, ambitious couple. They used tough love as a shield for their public cruelty, making every neighbor on this lawn feel like a participant in a righteous intervention. I want you to look at your own family right now. Ask yourself, who is the beam and who is the rot? Because for 30 months I had been the beam, and I had been very, very quiet about it. To the people at church cookouts and the neighbors who saw my car in the driveway at noon, my career as a remote logistics consultant was a hobby, a little computer task that kept me busy while Beckett did the real work. They saw him in his tailored shirts talking about Series A, funding and venture capital, and they saw me in my old flannels carrying out the trash. Contempt rolls downhill in a house built on lies, and I was at the bottom of the mountain. What they didn't see, and what the banker drinking Beckett's beer knew but chose to ignore, was the anatomy of the false narrative. They didn't see that the venture capital Beckett was so proud of was actually my manager's pension being drained $5,000 at a time to keep his servers running. They didn't see the silent transfers that covered the property taxes or the insurance on the very car Leanie used to drive her influencer lifestyle. The truth was messier, quieter, and far more expensive than anyone on this lawn could fathom. My primary weapon during those 30 months wasn't anger, it was a spreadsheet. It was a detailed clinical ledger of every dollar I had funneled into the black hole of my son's ambition. While the family saw a freeloader, that file saw a silent investor keeping a sinking ship afloat. Every time I saved his payroll, Beckett told the neighbors I'd asked for an extra grocery allowance. Every time I paid a vendor to keep them from suing his startup, Leanie posted a Facebook status about the burdens of caring for an aging parent. Families don't keep score, Beckett used to say whenever he was short on cash. But accountants do. And as a logistics man, I had become his unintentional accountant. The total after 3 years sat at a grotesque $156,000. But that number was a drop in the bucket compared to what I actually had hidden away, a fact that my banker knew well. He wasn't just laughing at a joke. He was laughing with Beckett Rhodes' college roommate, a boy I had personally helped get hired at that very bank years ago. The betrayal wasn't just a ripple, it was a flood. I realized then that my greatest mistake wasn't being poor or being a burden. It was being too useful while pretending to be invisible. I had created a monster of entitlement by refusing to let them feel the friction of their own failures. Their narrative was a perfectly tailored suit, but my truth was the razor blade hidden in the lining. I was a man of 62 who owned Detroit real estate and a stock portfolio that could buy every house on this block twice over. And I was being pelted with hot dogs by people who thought I was a charity case. The version they told at church cookouts was simple and clean, but the truth was far more expensive. I looked at the banker and then at Beckett, who was currently taking a selfie under the banner. He thought he was documenting his victory. He thought he was finally ridding himself of the only liability holding him back. He didn't know that the $156,000 I gave him wasn't actually help. It was a series of documented private loans with interest rates he had unknowingly signed off on during his late-night emergencies. I had the paper trail, I had the data, and I had the resolve. To understand why I stood there in the driveway and said nothing while they laughed, you have to understand the history of the Rhodes family. You have to understand that silence can be a gift, but it can also be a cage. I had been living in a cage I'd built out of my own loyalty and my wife's memory. The lie didn't start with a banner or a party. It didn't even start with Beckett's failing startup. It started with a promise I made over a fresh grave in 2015, a promise my son would eventually use to try and bury me alive. I stood there, a logistics manager, staring at a massive shipping error, and I realized it was time to reroute the entire manifest. The story of my downfall was about to become the record of their collapse. But first I had to remember the smell of the winter of 2015, the day the foundation cracked. Grief is a heavy fog, and in 2015, I let it blind me to the fact that my son wasn't mourning his mother. He was already measuring the estate. To understand the banner in the driveway and the banker with the beer, you have to stand with me in the stinging bite of that Michigan December. The air was a gray, suffocating weight, smelling of wet wool and the cloying funeral scent of lilies that seemed to cling to my skin. I stood at the graveside of my wife, Martha, watching the snow mix with the dark earth. She had been my compass for 30 years, the woman who kept my logistics brain from turning into a cold machine of numbers and routes. Beside me stood 26-year-old Beckett, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than the casket. I saw a broken boy, a son who had lost half of his world, and my heart ached for him in a way that overrode every analytical instinct I possessed. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder, feeling the expensive fabric of his coat, a coat I had bought for him only the week before, because he said he didn't have anything appropriate for a funeral. "I have got you, son," I whispered, my voice thick with the taste of cold coffee and grief. "Everything she and I built, the house, the savings, the security, it is all for you." I was making a vow, a blank check of loyalty signed in the presence of death. "I just want to move on, Dad," he replied, not looking at me. "This house, this life, it feels like a museum. I want to build something of my own." I thought he was talking about legacy. I didn't realize he was talking about distance. Within weeks of the funeral, the fog had not lifted, but Beckett was already packing. He claimed the house was too full of ghosts that he needed a fresh start in a luxury apartment downtown to clear his head for his new business idea. I was still reeling, still waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a hand that wasn't there, so I didn't question the logic. Loyalty is a debt that some people pay with love and others pay with silence. I was paying with both. I took on extra shifts at the logistics firm, pushing my 60-year-old bones to manage double the freight volume, just to ensure he could secure a place he couldn't afford on a founder's dream. I viewed it as a bridge for his healing process. I didn't see the entitlement taking root in the fertile soil of my sacrifice. One evening in early 2016, while helping him move some final boxes, I saw a printed draft on his desk. It was his first founder bio for a networking site. I read the words 3 times, certain I was misinterpreting them. He described himself as an orphan of circumstance who had fought through personal tragedy to build a vision from nothing. There was no mention of the father, who was currently paying his security deposit, or the mother, whose life insurance had just funded his first round of server hardware. It was a small betrayal, a marketing lie, I told myself. He just wants to look strong. "It is about my brand, Dad," he told me when I asked about his sudden hurry to leave. "I cannot be a founder living in a guest room. It doesn't scale." I stayed in the big quiet house, alone, the hallways echoing with a hollow sound that I tried to fill by talking to Martha's photograph on the mantle. "I am keeping my word, Martha," I would say to the silence. "He is going to be someone." I established a secret lifestyle of absolute frugality. I stopped eating out. I canceled my travel plans, and I wore the same 3 pairs of trousers until the cuffs frayed. I wanted every spare cent to go into his logistics software idea, a project I believed would be our shared pride. Have you ever looked at your own reflection and seen a stranger? simply because you gave everything away to someone who didn't even say thank you. My son only called when he needed a wire transfer by noon, or a signature on a corporate guarantee. He was always stressed, always in a meeting, always 1 month away from a breakthrough. I was the foundation of a skyscraper he was building out of sand, and I was happy to let the weight crush me. I was the invisible safety net catching him before he even knew he was falling. I would wire the money, ignore the coldness in his voice, and tell myself that this was what fathers did. We endure so they can soar. I spent my nights in a dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of a spreadsheet, where I tracked his progress, or at least the progress I thought he was making. I was a manager of routes and timing, but I had failed to account for the emotional cost of a one-way street. I thought the distance Beckett was creating was about his independence, but as 2017 rolled around, the cold truth started to seep through the floorboards. I realized that the fresh start he needed wasn't just about moving downtown. He was distancing himself from the medical debts he thought I still owed from Martha's long illness. He was afraid the ghosts of our past would come for his future bank account. He didn't know I had already cleared every cent of those debts in cash, working nights until my eyes bled. He thought I was a liability he had to manage. I thought I was the guardian of his future. I was the only one holding on to the past, keeping the museum clean, while he was busy selling off the exhibits in his mind. Then, in the spring of 2017, the phone rang. It wasn't about the servers or a wire transfer. Beckett's voice had a new edge, a sharp, polished clarity I hadn't heard before. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I'd visited the grave. He told me he'd found the woman who would finally help him replace me. He called her his strategist, his partner, the one who truly understood his vision. I thought I was finally going to have a daughter. I didn't know I was being introduced to the woman who would help him plan my final eviction. Leanie Rhodes didn't walk into my home so much as she appraised it, her eyes moving over the crown molding and the antique sideboard with the cold calculation of an estate liquidator. I thought I was the only one holding on to the past until Beckett called me in 2017 to tell me he had found the woman who would finally help him replace me, and when she stepped across the threshold, I felt a draft that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. Beckett looked at her with a desperate, hungry kind of pride, as if she were the final piece of software needed to launch his life into the stratosphere. Leanie Rhodes. My 33-year-old daughter-in-law adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked at me like I was a stain on her perfectly curated backyard. She didn't offer a hug or even a warm handshake. Instead, she traced a sharp, perfectly manicured fingernail along the wood of the entry table and smiled a thin, bloodless smile. "Conrad, honey, this space has such great legacy bones," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying floral perfume that seemed to colonize the air of the hallway. But the energy is stagnant. It's very museum-adjacent. I stood there, a man who had spent 40 years managing the flow of global commerce, feeling like a clumsy trespasser in my own living room. Beckett didn't defend the home where he'd grown up. He just nodded, eager to please. "Dad, Leanie thinks we need to optimize the domestic workflow if we are going to scale the business," he added, using a marketing jargon that felt like a foreign language in a house that used to smell like Martha's pot roast and wood smoke. It was the first time I heard the word optimize, but it wouldn't be the last. I noticed her planner sitting open on the table later that evening while I was making tea. I shouldn't have looked, but the logistical part of my brain is hardwired to scan for data. There, in neat aggressive script, were the square footage totals of every room and the current market value of my property calculated to the penny. She had audited my life before she even accepted Beckett's proposal. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous people always use the word optimize right before they start taking things away from you? The displacement happened in increments. By the spring of 2017, the wedding was in full swing, and I was footing the bill for a lavish rehearsal dinner at a high-end bistro in Ann Arbor. I had expected a moment of genuine family bonding, perhaps a toast to Martha, or a quiet acknowledgement of the foundation I had provided. Instead, I found myself seated at a secondary table near the kitchen door, far from the center of gravity. Taking center stage was Vaughn Redmond Leanie's 58-year-old father, who was already 3 beers deep and swinging a spatula like a scepter over a grill I had paid for. Vaughn was a man of loud stories and expensive wine that he didn't buy a professional charlatan who looked at me with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. "Families don't keep score, Conrad," he barked across the table after ordering another bottle of vintage Cabernet on my tab. "Just pass the check and enjoy the show." I looked at Beckett, hoping for a shred of the boy I had raised, but he was leaning in toward Vaughn, hanging on every word about the hustle of the modern age. Vaughn is a closer dad, Beckett told me when I tried to mention the mounting costs. He understands the speed of the market. He's helping us reposition the brand. I realized then that the role of the invisible father had been officially cemented. I was the bank, and the bank wasn't invited to the board meeting. Contempt is a slow-acting poison. You don't feel the sting until you try to stand up and realize your legs are already gone. I watched my son being molded into a stranger, his values being replaced by a shallow obsession with optics and speed, while I sat in the shadows of the restaurant I was paying to keep open. Shortly after the wedding, the infringement became physical. Leanie arrived at the house with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, claiming her father was between ventures and needed to stay in my guest room for just 2 weeks. Family helps family, right? She asked, her voice light, but her eyes hard. I couldn't say no without looking like the monster she was already painting me to be in her social media updates. Vaughn didn't arrive with a suitcase. He arrived with an invasion force. He moved in his boxes, his loud television, and his invasive booming energy that consumed the silence I had cultivated since Martha died. The worst of it was the truck. Vaughn parked his rusted, oil-leaking beast in the dead center of the driveway, blocking my sedan and marking his territory like an animal. I heard the metallic screech of Vaughn's truck brakes every afternoon, a sound that grated on my nerves like a physical assault. "Move your sedan to the street, pal," he told me one morning, while he was tinkering with the engine, letting black sludge drip onto the pristine concrete I had spent years maintaining. "The truck needs the level ground for the engine work. It's about maintenance, Conrad. You wouldn't understand." I looked at him then, at the oil soaking into the stone, and I felt a simmering anger that I had to keep under a tight lid. Vaughn Redmond didn't just enter my house. He was an invasive species choking out the native air until only he could breathe. He was a visual manifestation of the rot starting to settle into my life, a physical parasite that Leanie had invited in to drain what was left of my peace. She was using my home as a safe haven, I realized later, not for her father's comfort, but to hide his remaining assets from a massive civil judgment he was fleeing. Every day I spent in that house, I was becoming an unwitting accomplice to their greed. I looked at the black oil stain Vaughn's truck left on my pristine concrete and realized I wasn't the owner of this house anymore. I was just the bank that hadn't realized the vault was already empty. The sound of a baby crying, the only beautiful thing to happen in a year, defined by gathering shadows, filled the clinical sterile corridor of the maternity ward. The first time I held Marigold, I believed her tiny weight would be enough to anchor my son back to reality. I didn't realize she was the bait they'd used to bleed me dry. In that quiet hospital room in September 2018, the air smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweet scent of new life. I looked down at my 6-year-old granddaughter, Marigold Rhodes, who stood in her pink birthday dress in my memory. Though in that moment, she was merely a 7-pound bundle wrapped in a tight swaddle. She was the only person in the Rhodes lineage whose eyes didn't hold a price tag. I saw a spark of the old Beckett in my son's eyes as he watched me rock her. For a brief moment, the oily residue of Vaughn's presence in my driveway and Leanie's calculated remarks about my legacy bones seemed to evaporate. "She has your mother's chin, Beckett," I said softly, my voice catching on the dry air of the hospital. He nodded, his face softening with a rare sincerity. "She's going to have everything we didn't, Dad. I'm building a legacy for her. I made a silent vow right then to ensure this child never wanted for anything. A paternal instinct so raw and ancient that it blinded me to the fact that my vulnerability was being measured and logged by the woman resting in the bed behind us. 3 months later, the atmosphere at home had shifted from the euphoria of birth to the grinding gears of a trap being set. Marigold was home, and I had become the primary caregiver by default. I spent my nights in the nursery listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of a baby's breathing, while Beckett and Leanie attended what they called networking events. I didn't mind the labor. I loved that little girl with a ferocity that surprised even me. But I started noticing that every time Beckett came home, he brought a new layer of manufactured stress. Hope is a dangerous drug in the hands of a logistics man. It makes you overlook the friction in the system until the whole machine seizes. I watched him pace the hallway, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone, complaining about the stifling costs of fatherhood. "It's hard to focus on the code when I'm worried about her college fund already," he'd mutter just loud enough for me to hear. Leanie would chime in from the master bedroom, her voice like silk over a razor. "You're so good with her, Conrad. It's a shame the business takes Beckett away so much." It was a coordinated dance, a subtle manipulation designed to make me feel responsible for the financial pressure my son claimed to be under. I saw Vaughn in the kitchen drinking my coffee and nodding along, his presence a constant reminder that my house was no longer my own. One evening in January 2019, the shadows finally moved. I was in the kitchen cleaning a bottle when Beckett cornered me. He had his laptop open, and the screen was a sea of red spreadsheets. He looked older, more haggard, his glasses reflecting the blue light of the screen as he explained a dire emergency. A major investor had pulled out at the last second, he claimed, and he needed exactly $5,000 to cover a temporary cash flow gap or the startup would fold. He framed it as protecting Marigold's future, a tactical strike at the vow he knew I'd made in that hospital room. Have you ever noticed how the people who scream the loudest about legacy are usually the ones most willing to set the current house on fire for a quick buck? I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to play with wooden trains, but all I saw was a man who had learned how to weaponize guilt. It's just to bridge the gap. Daddy insisted, his voice cracking with a practiced desperation. 1 month. I'll pay it back with interest. I'm doing this for the baby Beckett, I told him, my voice calm, but my mind already scanning the data points. Not for your tech disruptor ego. I pulled out my checkbook and wrote the amount from my pension account, purposely hiding my larger millions to see if this was truly a one-time emergency. I needed to know if he was drowning or just greedy. The crisp sound of a check being torn from a ledger felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. I discovered later, through a stray piece of mail Beckett had carelessly left on the counter, that the major investor never actually existed. The $5,000 I just handed over wasn't for server space or payroll. It was used to pay for Vaughn's back taxes to keep him from being audited by the state. My son had lied to my face, using his daughter as a shield to protect a parasite. As I handed over the check, Beckett's hand trembled slightly, a detail I initially misread as relief. But then I looked past him into the hallway. Leanie was standing there, thinking she was out of sight, and I saw her trying to hide a large white shopping bag behind the umbrella stand. It was a new expensive designer handbag, a piece of calfskin luxury that I knew from my market research cost exactly $4,800. The check didn't feel like paper. It felt like a leash, and I was the one putting it around my own neck. I had just funded their vanity while believing I was securing a child's future. I watched Beckett's hand tremble as he took the first $5,000, and I realized with a cold shiver that he wasn't relieved, he was hungry. And $5,000 was just the appetizer. The logistics of the Rhodes household had changed forever. I was no longer a father or a grandfather in their eyes. I was a revenue stream that had finally been tapped, and they had no intention of letting the flow stop until the well was dry. A landslide doesn't start with a mountain falling. It starts with a single pebble that refuses to stay put. For me, that pebble was a $5,000 check that somehow grew into a $156,000 anchor. The first check was a pebble, but the landslide that followed nearly buried me. Over the next 30 months, the requests for money shifted from frantic emergencies to what Beckett and Leanie treated as regular maintenance. It became a background noise in the house, as rhythmic as the ticking of the clock in my empty office. I watched the montage of our lives play out through the digital glow of my spreadsheet, documenting a slow bleed they never expected me to track. 1 month, it was Beckett's business server costs. The next, it was quarterly property taxes Leanie claimed she had forgotten to account for in her busy schedule of curated social media posts. It is an investment in your legacy, Dad, Beckett would say with that practiced tech founder confidence. Don't be so old school about liquid assets. We just need this one last push to clear the Series A funding. I would nod, wire the funds, and record the transaction. I maintained my secret ledger with the grim resignation of a man watching a cargo ship take on water, while the crew was busy polishing the handrails. Beckett's startup remained a perpetually pre-revenue phantom, a black hole that consumed my manager's pension, while he talked about disrupting the market. Entitlement is the only debt that grows the more you pay it off. I saw the rot spreading in the way they stopped asking and started expecting. I discovered a document in the mudroom that confirmed my worst suspicions. Vaughn Redmond had been using my home address to apply for local government benefits. In a stroke of supreme gall, he had listed me as a dependent to increase his monthly checks. I was the one paying the mortgage, yet in the eyes of the state, I was the one being cared for. By the summer of 2023, the dynamic had shifted into something grotesque. Vaughn had officially turned my home into his personal headquarters. He spent his days drinking beer on the porch, holding court with the neighbors, like he owned the deed. Vaughn spent his afternoons spinning a narrative for anyone who would listen, painting a picture of a brilliant son burdened by a failing senile father. Poor Beckett, he would tell the neighbors while sipping a beer I had paid for. He works 80 hours a week just to keep the lights on for the old man. Conrad doesn't understand the modern hustle. He's lucky he has family to carry him through these final years. I would hear his booming, condescending laughter through the window, while I sat at my desk, my anger smoldering beneath a layer of analytical detachment. Have you ever been the person who pays for the stage only to realize the play being performed is a tragedy about your own incompetence? I was funding a social life where I was the punchline, and I was doing it with a level of precision that would have made my old logistics firm proud. The neighbors began to look at me with that specific brand of suburban pity, the kind that feels like being patted on the head by someone who thinks you've forgotten how to tie your own shoes. I let them think it. In logistics, the most valuable asset you can have is being underestimated. If they didn't think I was a threat, they wouldn't guard the gates. And the gates were swinging wider every single day as Beckett's greed outpaced his ability to lie. August 2024 arrived with a heat that felt as heavy as the atmosphere in that house. I returned from the grocery store one afternoon, the heavy plastic crinkle of bags digging into my fingers. I had just spent $300 on supplies for a household that treated me like a ghost. As I struggled toward the door, Vaughn stopped me in the driveway leaning against his rusted truck. Must be nice to have all that time to wander the aisles while my son is grinding in that office, he said, his breath smelling of stale beer. Beckett's heart is too big letting you live off his sweat like this. I looked at him then, at the black oil stain his truck was still leaving on my concrete, and I felt a cold strategic clarity wash over me. I remained silent, clutching the receipts that prove who actually owned the bread Vaughn was about to eat. Take a moment to look at the people around your table. Are they there for the meal, or are they there for the person serving it? I realized that Leanie and Beckett had stopped seeing me as a father years ago. I was just a utility, a resource to be managed until it ran dry. I thought about the hidden trash can I had found in the garage earlier that morning, filled with luxury delivery boxes for designer shoes and skincare sets. They were items Leanie bought using a secret credit card Beckett had opened in my name without my knowledge. They weren't just taking my money anymore. They were stealing my identity to fund a lifestyle of pure vanity. I walked into the house with the groceries, my knuckles white from the weight of the bags, and realized I didn't just have a son and a daughter-in-law anymore. I had a parasite that had finally reached my heart, and it was time to cut it out. The sound of Vaughn's condescending laughter followed me inside, but it didn't sting anymore. It sounded like a countdown. I put the milk in the refrigerator and went to my office to look at the final number on my spreadsheet, $156,000. That was the price of my education. I had spent 3 years learning exactly what my family was made of. They were ready to throw me to the wolves, unaware that I was the one who had been feeding them. It was time for the ghost to become the earthquake. While they were busy counting the pennies they thought I was costing them, I was stepping into a glass-walled office in Detroit to meet the man who helped me manage my millions. The transition from the stale, beer-scented air of my Ann Arbor driveway to the cool, filtered atmosphere of this high-rise felt like ascending to another planet. I watched the Detroit skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city below bustling with a purpose that Beckett and Leanie had long since abandoned for the easy dopamine of social media metrics. Silas Whitaker, my 42-year-old financial advisor, and the man I'd mentored when he had nothing but a suit and a work ethic, sat ready with the files that would end the lie. He rose as I entered, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Conrad, it is always an honor," he said, his voice carrying the calm weight of true professionalism. "Most clients are just numbers on a spreadsheet, but you are the reason I am in this chair." I took the seat opposite him, feeling the familiar support of expensive leather beneath me. I didn't want pleasantries today. I wanted data. "Let us look at the growth, Silas," I replied. "I need to know exactly how much power I am holding before I pull the trigger. Wealth isn't about what you spend. It is about what you choose not to say." For years, I had chosen to say nothing, living on my manager's pension, while my true assets grew in the dark like a well-tended forest. Silas opened a thick leather binder, the smell of fresh ink and quality bond paper filling the space between us. He started with the Detroit real estate holdings I'd acquired post-2008. Properties that were once eyesores were now the backbone of a revitalized district, their values having quintupled, while Beckett was busy pitching apps that didn't work. Then we moved to the diversified stock portfolio, a collection of blue-chip giants and compounding index funds I'd been feeding since the 1980s. The final number on the screen didn't just flash. It hummed with the force of 40 years of discipline. $4,217,000. "It is funny, isn't it?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Beckett thinks I am a freeloader for eating his eggs and using his electricity while I could buy the whole grocery store chain that supplied them." Silas shook his head, a look of profound disbelief in his eyes. "He has no idea, does he? I've been paying your firm a monthly consulting fee for years. Silas and I want to ensure that the reinvestment trust for Marigold is fully separate. My son will never touch a cent of that legacy. He has proven he lacks the character to manage wealth. He only knows how to consume it. Would you rather be the man who everyone thinks is rich while he's broke, or the man who everyone thinks is broke while he owns the building?" I had made my choice long ago. And now the bill was coming due. There was a specific irony in the way Silas looked at me with a debt of gratitude that Beckett couldn't even conceptualize. 15 years ago, Silas was a struggling junior associate, and I had given him the advice and the initial capital that launched his career. He was the son of my choice, a mirror of what Beckett could have been if he'd listened to the silence of hard work instead of his own ego. Silas leaned forward, his expression hardening into something clinical and lethal. "I will handle the dirty work of the legal separation, Conrad. I've already got the Nashville condo papers ready for your signature, and the 31-page audit for the diner meeting is airtight. We have every wire transfer, every hidden credit card bill, and every single receipt documented." "Good," I said, taking the heavy fountain pen he offered. I heard the scratching sound of the nib across the paper, a final permanent sound. I want them to see the numbers. I want them to see exactly what silence sounds like when it is backed by a bank. I was no longer a father begging for a place at the table. I was the landlord of their entire existence, and I was about to issue an eviction notice they couldn't ignore. Silas cleared his throat, a hesitant look crossing his face. "There is one more thing you should know, Conrad. Beckett recently tried to pitch his failing startup to this firm for a private investment round. He had no idea I work for you. He described you in his pitch deck as a legacy liability. I felt the metallic taste of a fresh betrayal, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, strategic finality. Silas was a mirror of what Beckett could have been if he'd listened to the silence instead of his own ego. My son had walked into this very building, perhaps even sat in the lobby I just walked through, and tried to sell my soul to my own friend for a chance at a check. He was truly his own worst enemy, a logistics failure of the highest order. I signed the final transfer for the Nashville condo, the weight of the move finally becoming a reality. Silas handed me a folder containing a recording Beckett had sent his firm as part of the Founder's Vision interview. I pressed play on the small digital device Silas placed on the mahogany desk. My son's voice filled the room, sounding polished, arrogant, and utterly hollow. "My father is the only liability holding me back," Beckett said in the recording. "He is a relic of an old way of thinking, a drain on the company's emotional resources." When I heard those words, I didn't feel the sting of a wounded parent. I felt the focus of a manager who had just identified the primary bottleneck in a failing system. I looked at Silas and nodded. "Ensure the shutoffs are timed for Monday morning after the party. I want the servers, the lights, and the water to go dark the moment I cross the Tennessee state line. It was time for the legacy liability to stop supporting the weight." As I signed the final transfer for the Nashville condo, Silas handed me a folder containing a recording Beckett had sent his firm, and when I pressed play, I heard my son describe me as the only liability holding him back. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the death of a delusion, a cold clarity that only comes when you hear your own flesh and blood price out your soul. I drove home from Silas's office with that digital recording, burning a hole in my pocket, listening to my son sell my soul to strangers for a chance at a check. The highway stretched out before me, a gray ribbon of reality cutting through the fog of my own paternal hope. I had been the foundation for 30 months, a silent support beam, in a house that was currently being eaten by termites. I pulled into the driveway quietly, the sound of the engine dying a soft death in the humid July evening. I entered through the back door, the heavy bags of expensive groceries I had just bought, digging into my palms $100 worth of artisan bred fresh produce, and the high-end coffee Leanie insisted on. I stopped in the mudroom, the cool air of the house hitting my face, but the temperature inside felt far lower than the thermostat indicated. I heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was a huddled rhythmic whispering, Beckett, Leanie, and Vaughn. They weren't arguing for once, they were planning with a terrifying unified efficiency. "We can't just wait for him to take the hint." Beckett, I heard Leanie say, her voice carrying that sharp corporate edge she used for her branding meetings. "The optics of having a dependent living in the guest room are killing our Series A. He is a liability we can't afford to carry anymore. I stood frozen, the grocery bags crinkling slightly as I held my breath. Have you ever stood in your own home and felt like a burglar simply because you realized the people inside were stealing your life? I felt like a ghost haunting my own hallways. A man who had paid for the floor he was currently standing on, only to realize the wood was rotting beneath his feet. Beckett's response was a low, pathetic mumble, but I heard it clearly through the cracked door. He's right. Marigold's party is the perfect cover. Public pressure is the only thing the old man respects. He won't cause a scene if everyone is watching. I leaned against the mudroom wall, my mind racing through the logistics of the betrayal. I realized that the Series A Beckett was so worried about wasn't a venture capital infusion at all. It was actually a high-interest loan from a predatory lender that Vaughn had introduced him to. A debt that Beckett had secured by using my house as collateral through a forged signature I had seen in a digital file only hours before. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers over a cup of coffee you paid for. From the shadows of the doorway, I watched them through the gap. They were hunched over the kitchen island, looking at a notepad where Vaughn was sketching out red block letters. It was the birth of the banner plan. Leanie was explaining how to frame me as a senile burden to the neighbors, a tragic figure of mental decline that they were heroically managing. "It's not cruel, it's a wake-up call," she whispered, her eyes bright with the excitement of a new campaign. "Once the neighbors see the banner, he won't dare cause a scene. He's too proud to admit he's been living on our charity." I looked at my son, waiting for a shred of the boy I had raised, but his hesitation was brief and hollow, easily crushed by Vaughn's insistence that I was bleeding them dry. The very lie I had been funding with my secret millions was now the justification for my public execution. Before I let you hear what I heard next in that kitchen, if you are still watching this, unfold with me. Finish this sentence in the comments. I knew it was over when, because this next part is a point of no return. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message is what matters most. If this crosses your comfort line, you are free to stop here. I backed away from the door with the slow, deliberate care of a man defusing a bomb. I left the bags of groceries on the mudroom bench, a silent testament to my presence that I knew they wouldn't notice until the morning. I didn't want a confrontation, not yet. A logistics manager knows that the most effective strike is the one the enemy never sees coming. I walked back out to my car, the recording from Silas still heavy and cold in my pocket. As I passed the mudroom window, I saw Leonie's open laptop on the bench. On the screen was a draft of a tough love Facebook post, pre-scheduled for the day of the party. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, detailing my supposed mental decline to preemptively discredit anything I might say when they threw me out. They wanted an audience. They wanted the neighborhood to applaud while they stripped me of my dignity. I sat in the dark of my sedan, the interior smelling of old leather and the lingering scent of my wife's perfume, on a scarf I'd never moved. My hand was trembling, but not from fear. It was the vibration of a decisive retreat. I realized the family I had tried to save was already dead, replaced by a triad of predators who saw me as nothing more than a carcass to be picked clean. I decided right then to let the party happen not as a victim, but as the architect of their final collapse. I dialed Silas, my voice steady and low. "Silas, it's me. Move the Nashville move-in date up. We're done playing defense. I want the 31-page audit ready for print by Monday." They wanted a show, and I was going to give them a front-row seat to the truth. I sat in the dark of my sedan, my hand trembling as I dialed Silas, and realized that for 30 months I had been the foundation, but starting tomorrow I was going to be the earthquake. I didn't go back inside that night. I drove to a flickering motel neon sign, opened my laptop, and began the digital audit that would turn my son's comfortable lie into a catastrophic reality. The room was small and smelled of industrial lemon cleaner, a sterile contrast to the heavy toxic atmosphere of the house I had just left. I sat on the edge of the bed, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my glasses as I pulled up the road strategy files Silas had prepared. It was the first week of August, and I had exactly 4 weeks before the scheduled birthday party. I spent the next 7 days meticulously documenting every autopay, every subscription, and every utility account tied to my personal credit cards. I treated it like a complex logistics problem, identifying the critical failure points in Beckett's household and business operations. "It is not enough to leave," I whispered to the empty room. "I have to stop being the ghost in their machine. Every light bill I paid was a brick in the wall of their entitlement, and I was going to remove every single one of them. I began scheduling the cancellation of these services to coincide perfectly with the days following the party. I was precise. I was clinical. I was the architect of a controlled demolition. Revenge isn't a heat-of-the-moment act. For a logistics man, it is a scheduled delivery. I ensured that I intentionally sent final notice warnings from the utility companies to my own private email for months, archiving them immediately so Beckett would have no paper trail of the impending shutoffs. He would wake up in a dead house and he wouldn't even know who to call. By the second week of August, I was coordinating with Silas to bridge the gap between my old life and my new one in Nashville. We secured a high-end condo overlooking the river and a new consulting contract with a national freight firm that actually valued 40 years of experience. I returned to the house every evening acting completely normal. I shared dinner with Leanie and Beckett, listening to them talk about the upcoming party with a growing arrogance. They believed I was finally beaten a broken old man who had accepted his fate as a dependent. While Leanie critiqued the vintage sideboard for her social media followers, I was secretly moving my True Valuables Martha's journals, my vintage watch collection, and my private legal files to a secure storage unit on the edge of town. The Nashville closing is set for the first of the month, Conrad Silas told me over an encrypted line. You are free. I looked across the dinner table at my son, who was complaining about a minor glitch in his server software. Good, I replied. I want to be 500 miles away when the first utility check bounces. How many second chances do you give a person before you realize you are just funding your own execution? I had given Beckett 30 months of second chances, and he had used every one of them to sharpen the knife he intended to put in my back. During the third week, I watched Vaughn Redmond help Beckett stretch the red block letters of the banner across the garage door. I offered a polite nod as I walked past them, carrying a small box of what they assumed was trash. In reality, it was the last of my tax records. I was moving through the house like a shadow, pulling the threads out of their safety net one by one until only the holes remained. I removed myself from the emergency contact lists at Beckett's office. I notified the property management company that I was resigning as the informal supervisor of the rentals. Every safety valve I had managed for years was being closed. I made sure the car insurance on Vaughn's truck was the very last thing scheduled for cancellation. He was so busy playing the king of my driveway that he didn't notice the crown was made of ice and the sun was coming up. I caught Marigold watching me from the hallway one afternoon. Her eyes were wide and curious, seeing the boxes I was quietly moving out. I gave her a small, sad smile and a finger to my lips. She didn't understand the logistics, but she understood the silence. I was the foundation of a skyscraper he was building out of sand, and I was finally stepping aside. The final week of August arrived with a humid, heavy heat that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. I taped the last box shut in the dry, dusty silence of the storage unit. The sound of the packing tape screeching off the roll was the only music I needed. I looked at the small black device in my palm, a GPS tracker I had found hidden under the bumper of my car earlier that morning. Beckett wanted to know where I was going, but he had no idea I was already gone. He was still tracking a man who had already mentally crossed the state line. I had built a life on timing and routes, and this final route was the most important one I had ever mapped. I drove back to the house one last time to prepare for the party. The tracker now sitting on the shelf of a passing semi-truck I'd tagged in the motel parking lot. My son would spend his afternoon tracking a ghost heading toward Chicago, while I was sitting right under his nose. I stood in the driveway looking at the Goodbye Freeloader banner in the harsh Michigan sunlight. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, a public declaration of his own failure disguised as my shame. I smiled a cold and hollow expression. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that makes you believe in justice. I was ready. The earthquake was scheduled and the epicenter was right here. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that makes you believe in justice. I parked a block away, straightened the collar of the shirt my wife bought me for our last anniversary, and walked toward the sound of country music and the smell of a BBQ I'd unintentionally financed. I didn't rush. A logistics man knows that timing isn't just about speed. It is about the interval between the expected and the inevitable. I taped the last box shut in my mind, leaving behind the man who allowed himself to be a floorboard for ungrateful feet. As I rounded the corner, the sight of my own home, the house I'd paid the down payment on 10 years ago, turned my stomach. The professional-grade vinyl banner was still there, draped over the garage like a shroud of red block letters that shouted, "Goodbye, freeloader," to the entire street. The neighborhood elite people I had known for decades were gathered on the lawn with craft beers and wine coolers, their laughter a sharp contrast to the serene Michigan sky. It was a gauntlet of grins. Suburban gossip is like a grass fire. It's shallow, but it moves fast and leaves everything black behind it. I felt their eyes on me, pitying smirks, whispers behind hands, and the performative tough love energy that Leanie had cultivated so carefully. "Nice of you to show up for your own funeral," Conrad, one neighbor, muttered as I passed. "Maybe this is the wake-up call he needs, another added loud enough for me to hear." I kept my expression a mask of stoic iron, absorbing the insults with a logistics manager's patience, waiting for the gap in the freight to make my move. I reached the edge of the driveway and saw Beckett. He was standing by the grill, playing the role of the master of ceremonies, with a spatula in one hand and a cold beer in the other. When he spotted me, he didn't look ashamed. He looked energized by the audience. He spread his arms wide as if welcoming a stray dog that had finally wandered back to the porch. "Look, everyone. The man of the hour is here to grab his last free burger," he shouted, prompting a roar of approval from the guests. I noticed something then that made my blood run cold. Glinting on his wrist was my father's vintage watch, a piece Beckett had looked me in the eye and claimed was lost months ago. The theft was ongoing, brazen, and entirely without remorse. I stood my ground, my silhouette tall against the afternoon sun. "I'm just here for what belongs to me, Beckett, nothing more." There is no sound quite like 30 people laughing at a man they used to respect. He just chuckled and turned back to the grill, dismissing me as a nuisance he'd already managed. I realized then that the lie had already been crowned king in this arena. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the entertainment of a downfall. Leanie appeared, then stepping between me and the front door. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, which reflected the hideous banner behind her like a twin set of distorted mirrors. She was the director of this social execution, and she wasn't about to let me off script. "You don't get to walk into this house anymore." "Conrad," she said, her voice carrying that sharp, polished edge she used for her branding meetings, "you haven't earned the right to cross this threshold. Your junk has already been boxed and labeled." I looked at her then, passed her into the foyer of the house I'd maintained for 30 years. I wasn't there for the boxes of old flannels or the dusty books. I was there for the one thing I knew she was planning to steal. "I'm here for my late wife's wedding ring, Leanie. I know you found it in the safe." When she stiffened, claiming the ring was family property and trying to bar my path with her small manicured frame, I didn't argue. "How much of your own dignity are you willing to trade for a daughter-in-law's approval?" For me, the trade was over. I used my height and the cold authority of a man who no longer cared about optics. I stepped forward not with violence, but with a momentum that could not be stopped by words alone. "Step aside before I make this party very uncomfortable for your guests," I said, my voice a low vibration that finally made her eyes widen with a flicker of genuine fear. As she tried to block me, shifting her weight in a panic, her designer clutch slipped from her hand. It hit the porch with a hollow thud and popped open. A small slip of paper fluttered out, landing face up near my shoe. It was a pawn shop appraisal slip dated yesterday for an antique platinum wedding set. The betrayal was complete. She was planning to sell Martha's ring on Monday morning to fund the next chapter of her curated life. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a daughter-in-law. I saw a scavenger. I didn't wait for her to move. I stepped into the foyer of the house I'd paid for, and for the first time in 30 months, I didn't care if I was being polite. The air inside the house felt different, sterile, stripped of the scent of Martha's lilies, replaced by the cloying floral perfume Leanie favored. I could hear the party continuing outside, the country music thumping against the walls, but inside it was the sound of a crime scene where the evidence had already been wiped clean. I walked past the turned-down family photos, my knuckles white as I gripped the banister. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was a ghost, reclaiming his haunting grounds. The house I spent 30 years maintaining smelled like strange cleaners and a future that didn't include me. Every family photo already turned face down, like I was a ghost they were trying to exorcise. The interior felt like a crime scene, where the evidence of my life had already been wiped clean. I didn't wait for Leanie to move. I stepped into the foyer of the house I'd paid for, and for the first time in 30 months, I didn't care if I was being polite. The air inside was cool and sterile, stripped of the scent of Martha's lilies, and replaced by a sharp industrial lemon floor wax. I moved through the hallway with the heavy clinical gait of a man who knew every structural flaw and every solid beam. Every step on the hardwood was a reminder of the thousands I had spent on the maintenance of a building that had now become my primary antagonist. I noted the efficiency with which Beckett and Leanie had erased my presence. My books were gone from the built-in shelves. My favorite leather armchair had been replaced by a sleek, uncomfortable modern sofa. I was a stranger in my own skin, navigating a crime scene where the evidence of my existence had already been wiped. I found my way to the master bedroom, which had been repurposed into a content studio for Leonie's brand. Ring lights stood like skeletal sentries where my dresser used to be, and racks of designer clothes occupied the corner where Martha's vanity once sat. On the desk, I caught sight of a printout, a listing for a vintage car auction. Leanie had already listed Martha's 1968 Mustang as a single-owner vehicle from an estate sale. The implication was as sharp as a razor in her narrative. I was already deceased. How much is a memory worth when it's being sold by people who only see the scrap value of your life? I headed straight for the jewelry armoire, a heavy oak piece I'd bought for Martha on our 20th anniversary. It was the only thing in the room that hadn't been replaced by white and gold aesthetic furniture. I pulled the small velvet drawer, the one with the hidden latch Martha and I had joked about for decades. I found the wedding ring hidden at the bottom of a velvet tray, but it wasn't just sitting there. It had been tagged with a small white sticker, a lot number, or a price. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy platinum band, and the weight of 30 years of loyalty hit me like a physical impact. This wasn't just jewelry. It was the physical manifestation of the promise I'd kept long after the woman who wore it had left. I heard the frantic click of heels behind me. "Put that back." Leanie shrieked, her voice bouncing off the acoustic foam panels she'd installed on the walls. "That is an asset of this household, Conrad, you're trespassing." I turned slowly, holding the ring up between my thumb and forefinger. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. My silence was more terrifying than her noise, a cold pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "This was Martha's," I said, my voice a low vibration. "You don't even know her middle name, Leanie. You don't get to sell her soul to pay for your vanity. Greed has a sound. It's the high-pitched vibration of a person who thinks they've already won and suddenly realizes the ground is shifting." She didn't look ashamed. She looked inconvenienced, her face twisting into a mask of shallow indignation as she reached for her phone. I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers, with the force of a man who no longer acknowledged her existence as an obstacle. I exited the bedroom and began my descent, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the hollow shell of my former home. I reached the landing and stopped. 6-year-old Marigold was standing in the hallway, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit and looking up at me with eyes that were wide and wet. She was trembling, the quiet, muffled sound of her sobbing, cutting through the country music that was still blasting from the backyard. The child's confusion about the party that looked like a war zone broke through my clinical exterior, the only crack in my armor. "Grandpa, why is everyone mean to you?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. I knelt to her level, ignoring the shouting Leanie behind me and the mockery waiting outside. I took her small hands in mine, the only honest moment in a house built on lies. "Because sometimes people are afraid of the truth, sweetheart," I whispered. I gave her a small, sad smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are already looking at the exit. "I'll see you soon, I promise." I was leaving behind a house, but I was carrying the only piece of the foundation that mattered in my pocket. Leanie reached the bottom of the stairs, then physically pulling the child away from me with a jagged, performative movement. "Stay away from her." She screamed, her voice intended for the neighbors watching through the open front door. "You're a dangerous old man. You're scaring your own granddaughter." I stood up, the platinum ring tucked safely into the small pocket of my trousers. I realized then that she wasn't just defending her assets. She had already changed the security codes on the alarm panel, the blue light blinking with a code I no longer knew. I caught sight of a work order on the mudroom bench as I walked toward the door. A moving truck was scheduled to arrive in precisely 2 hours to take my life to the dump. They weren't just evicting me, they were erasing the record. I walked out onto the porch, the heavy Michigan humidity settling on the back of my neck like a wet cloth. I looked out at the sea of neighbors now standing in a circle of judgment. I saw Vaughn Redmond raising a beer to the crowd, his face flushed with the triumph of a scavenger. I felt the cold weight of the ring against my hip, and I knew the hot dog he was about to throw was going to be the most expensive meal he ever served. I didn't look back at the banner. I walked toward the sidewalk, a logistics manager who had just cleared the final shipment and realized the warehouse was on fire. I descended the porch steps not as a grandfather leaving a party, but as a silent explosion walking through a crowd of people who didn't yet realize they were standing in the blast zone. The walk back to my car felt longer than the 30 months I'd spent as their ghost, every step heavy with the finality of the bridge I was burning behind me. I didn't look at the "Goodbye Freeloader" banner again. I didn't need to. Its red block letters were already etched into my retinas, a permanent receipt of the price I had paid for my own silence. As I reached the edge of the driveway, the smell of burnt grill grease and cheap beer followed me, a cloying Suburban perfume that I was eager to wash off. Vaughn Redmond, egged on by the crowd's performative laughter, decided to provide the grand finale. He wound up like a drunken pitcher and hurled a half-eaten hot dog at my retreating back. It missed my head by inches, but struck the passenger door of my car with a wet slapping sound, leaving a jagged smear of mustard and yellow grease against the silver paint. The neighborhood elite erupted in cheers, a roar of approval for the man who had just stoned the man who paid for his beer. "Don't come back until you've got a paycheck to show for it, Dad." Beckett shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate arrogance. I didn't flinch. Cruelty is a performative art, and my family had been rehearsing this show for 30 months. I simply unlocked the door and stood there for a moment, letting the humid Michigan air settle around me one last time. I noticed then with a sharp clinical satisfaction that the car I was about to enter wasn't actually my own. I had secretly sold my primary vehicle 2 days prior, arranged the title transfer in a quiet Detroit office, and used the proceeds to fund the first 6 months of the Elder Protection Fund I was establishing with Silas. The car I was driving now was a generic sedan that would be returned to a Nashville lot in less than 24 hours. They were throwing garbage at a phantom. I pulled out my phone, not to call for help, but to capture the evidence. I took a single panoramic photo of the scene, the hideous banner, the grinning, flushed faces of my son and daughter-in-law, and Vaughn raising his bottle in mock victory. The photo wasn't a memory. It was a receipt for the total cost of my loyalty. Beckett's laughter faltered for a heartbeat when he saw me looking through the lens. "What? Taking a souvenir for your scrapbook of failures," he sneered. "No," I replied, my voice a low-level vibration that seemed to carry further than his shouts. "For later." I made eye contact with him one last time, my expression so devoid of emotion, so utterly drained of the paternal warmth he had exploited, that he actually took a step back toward the grill. He saw the logistics manager in that moment, the man who timed freight and managed risk, and for a second, he looked like he might ask a question he wasn't ready to hear the answer to. I didn't give him the chance. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and engaged the locks. I drove away in absolute silence, the sound of Marigold's distant, confused crying finally fading behind the increasing roar of the highway tires on asphalt. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew exactly what was back there, a house built on my sweat and a family built on my silence. I drove for 10 miles before the internal pressure became too much. I pulled over at a nondescript rest stop, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I sat in the darkened cabin. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Martha's ring. The platinum was cold against my palm, a heavy, honest weight in a world that had become entirely weightless. "I'm sorry, Martha," I whispered to the empty car. I tried to save him. Now I'm just saving what's left of us. How far do you have to drive before the sound of your own heart beating becomes louder than the lies you were told? I realized that by turning that key and crossing the city limits, I had triggered the countdown on every bill insurance policy and business subscription I had secretly maintained for 3 years. I was no longer the foundation. I was the vacuum left behind. I pulled up my contacts and dialed Silas. "Silas, I'm on the road," I said, my voice steady as I merged back onto I-75 South. "Don't answer the phone when they start calling on Monday. Let the silence do the work." I began the 9-hour drive toward Nashville, the sharp blue glare of the phone screen, the only light in the cabin. My smart home app pinged with a final notification from the Ann Arbor house. I tapped the alert and watched the low-resolution feed from the mudroom camera I hadn't yet deactivated. Vaughn Redmond had already entered my old room. He was laughing as he grabbed the books from my nightstand, the histories and logistics manuals I'd kept since the 80s, and began throwing them out the window into the wet grass of the yard. He was clearing out the trash before I was even out of the county. I watched for 30 seconds, seeing my life being treated like a landfill, and then I deleted the app. I didn't need to see the rest. I knew exactly how the manifest would play out. I crossed the Tennessee state line at midnight, the rhythmic hum of the highway feeling like a heartbeat. Just as the "Welcome to Tennessee" sign flashed in my headlights, my phone lit up with the first of many automated alerts. The high-capacity business software subscription I'd been paying for under my LLC had just lapsed due to non-payment. Beckett's digital empire, the one he used to pitch to investors while calling me a liability, was about to go dark. The foundation was officially gone. I crossed the Tennessee state line at midnight, my phone lighting up. With the first of many automated alerts, the business software subscription had just lapsed, and Beckett's digital empire was about to go dark. Monday morning in Nashville was a symphony of quiet luxury, but 500 miles away in Ann Arbor, the first movement of Beckett's collapse was playing out in a series of dark screens and dead phone lines. I woke up in my new condo as the morning sun hit the Cumberland River, the light shimmering across the hardwood floors I actually owned. There were no boots thumping in the hallway, no loud beer-soaked arguments on the porch, and no cloying scent of Leonie's perfume colonizing the air. I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee that tasted of victory and calculated distance. I had crossed the state line at midnight, and precisely at 8 o'clock, the digital triggers I had set with Silas began to fire. Back in Michigan, Beckett arrived at his startup headquarters to find his team of 3 sitting in the dark. The proprietary logistics software he claimed to have built the cornerstone of his pitch to investors was nothing more than a white-labeled version of a much cheaper program I had been financing through a managed subscription under my own business, LLC. When the clock struck 9, the payment portal for that subscription refreshed, saw that my card had been removed, and slammed the door shut. Beckett stared at a screen that read, "Payment required" in bold, mocking letters. He tried his primary business card, then Leanie's, and finally he looked for the backup card he had always relied on my card. But I had deleted the profile on Friday night. Entitlement is a blindfold. It works perfectly until you need to see the edge of the cliff, and my son was currently stepping into thin air. He shouted at his employees, demanding they fix the server glitch, oblivious to the fact that the glitch was the absence of his father's wallet. I watched the news on a television I had purchased with my own clear title, enjoying the silence of a house that didn't treat me like a ghost. My phone began to ping with notifications, but they weren't messages from my family. They were access-denied alerts from the family's shared Amazon, Netflix, and commercial utility portals. For 30 months, I had provided the administrative labor that kept their world turning. I had been the invisible current in their wires, the man who knew the passwords and the meter numbers. Now they were standing in a dead house, holding a broken plug. I realized that Beckett didn't even know the password to his own workshop's power account. He had outsourced his entire existence to a man he called a freeloader. How many of you know the password to the machine that keeps your life running? Or are you just a passenger in someone else's labor? I watched the alerts pile up with a cold, detached satisfaction. I had spent years being the floor they walked on, and I had finally decided to become the ceiling that was caving in. Beckett's employees began to pack their bags as the office temperature rose, and the client demos scheduled for noon became an impossibility. They realized the startup was a house of cards, and the man at the top didn't even have enough credit to keep the lights on. I imagine Leonie's face when she realized her influencer studio was just a room with no power, her designer bags sitting in the dark like the hollow trophies they were. They had traded a father's loyalty for a temporary aesthetic, and the bill had finally come due. By noon, the digital glitch escalated into a physical crisis. The property management company, the one I had resigned from supervising, called Beckett to report that the water at his primary rental property had been shut off due to non-payment. I had been topping off that bill for a year to ensure his tenants didn't sue him for negligence. Now the tap was dry. Beckett realized he was illiterate in his own business's infrastructure. He didn't have the files, the account numbers, or the authority to restore service. He called me 6 times in the span of 10 minutes, his voice progressing from demanding to outright panicked in the voicemails I chose not to listen to. I had deactivated my old voicemail anyway. He was screaming into a vacuum. "Dad, pick up. There's some mistake with the DTE account. Just put your card back on for an hour. I can't have the tenants calling lawyers," he pleaded. He didn't understand that the mistake was his belief that my resources were his birthright. I had been the invisible current in their wires, but now I was the wall they kept hitting. Vaughn Redmond, I assumed, was likely wandering the Ann Arbor house by flashlight, cursing the man who had supposedly bled them dry. Beckett called a 7th time, shouting at a utility representative on the phone as his office lights flickered and died for good. "I don't care about the policy I need the water on, now. My tenant is a lawyer," he screamed. He was a small man in a large crisis, a founder with no foundation. I stood on my balcony and looked toward the horizon, the Nashville skyline, a promise of a future where I didn't have to be anyone's invisible floor. I realized then that Beckett had discovered the final piece of the administrative puzzle. He had gone to the digital filing cabinet I'd left open, hoping to find the lease for his commercial space so he could talk his way out of the blackout. What he found instead was a notice to quit, delivered to the inbox I had closed on Friday. The office lease was in my name, and the grace period for his lack of productivity had expired. I had timed the delivery perfectly. I was no longer playing defense. I was the earthquake. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and thought about the silence back in Michigan. Beckett had thrown his phone against the office wall just as the final server rack powered down, plunging the room into a silence so absolute it sounded like a funeral. He was alone in the dark, and for the first time in his life, he was going to have to find his own way out. I was no longer the freeloader. I was the man who had finally stopped carrying the world on his back, and the sound of it hitting the ground was the sweetest music I had ever heard. If Monday was a warning, Tuesday was an autopsy, and Beckett was about to find out that the heart of his business had stopped beating months ago. I watched the first wave of his panic from my balcony in Nashville, but by mid-morning, Beckett was standing in the lobby of our local Ann Arbor bank branch. He wasn't there for a social call. He was there because his dashboard was screaming in red, and his cards had been spit out by every terminal in the city. He walked up to the teller with that frantic, sweaty entitlement that I had come to recognize as his default state. He expected a glitch. He expected a simple technical error that could be brushed aside with a few keystrokes and a charming smile. "There has to be a mistake," he told the teller, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I just checked the dashboard last week. We have over 8,000 in the operating account." The teller didn't look up immediately. She clicked through a few screens, her expression shifting from professional boredom to a sharp clinical pity. "Sir," she said, her voice echoing in the marble lobby, "the account isn't at 8,000. It is currently $2,900 in the negative." Beckett's face went the color of unbaked dough. "That is impossible. I have investors, I have capital. Sir, the account holder of the linked backup account removed the authorization on Friday night. All the daily overdrafts and floating funds that were being automatically covered have hit the primary ledger at once. Numbers don't lie, but they can be silenced. And for 30 months, I was the one paying for the silence." My son stood there realizing for the first time that the safety net wasn't just frayed, it had been cut away entirely by the man he called a freeloader. He rushed back to the office, his mind likely spinning with the discovery that his Series A investor was actually an alias for Silas Whitaker. I had asked Silas to string him along to see if Beckett would ever mention my contributions in the business plan. He never did. He reached the lobby to find his 3 employees, the grinders he boasted about leading, waiting for him. The air in the room was stale, the ventilation long since dead. They hadn't been paid. The payroll check I usually quietly backed had bounced into the abyss of his overdraft. Beckett tried to pivot. He tried to use that founder charisma, the same one he used to convince the neighbors I was a burden. "I'm an entrepreneur, not a magician." He shouted, his hands trembling as he reached for a phone that was no longer connected to a network. "Give me 24 hours to move some capital." One of the developers, a young man who had worked through 3 weekends for Beckett's vision, just shook his head. "Capital, Beckett, you can't even pay the electric bill. We're done." Have you ever seen a man realize he's been drowning while thinking he was walking on water? Beckett watched them pack their bags in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The startup was revealed as a hollow stage set a house of cards that had only stayed upright because I was the one holding the glue. They walked out, leaving him alone in a dark room with the shattered remains of the phone he had thrown against the wall the day before. Leanie arrived 30 minutes later, her designer heels clicking on the floor with a jagged, panicked rhythm. She had seen the banking alerts on her own phone, the ones tied to the business card Beckett let her use for her influencer lifestyle. For the first time, her brand consultant mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She looked at the empty desks, the dark monitors, and the husband who was currently sliding down the wall in a state of catatonic shock. "You told me he was the one taking from us, Beckett." She shrieked, her voice stripped of its curated silk. "You said he was a drain. You said your business was the one keeping us afloat." Beckett looked up at her, his eyes hollow. I didn't know he was doing all this behind the scenes, Leanie. I didn't know about the manual transfers. He made himself invisible. He realized then that everything he mocked me for my hobby and my presence was actually the structural integrity of his entire world. Respect evaporates quickly when the air conditioning stops working and the checks start bouncing. Leanie looked around the office, her survivalist panic overriding any loyalty she had to her husband. She realized she had hitched her wagon to a fraud, a man who didn't even know how to pay his own rent without his father's permission. As the last employee walked out, he didn't say goodbye. He simply dropped a thick envelope on Beckett's desk. It was a letter from the landlord, the kind of document that usually went to the P.O. box I had closed on Friday. Beckett opened it with numb fingers. It stated that the security deposit, the one Leonie thought was her own contribution to their empire, was actually a personal check from Conrad Rhodes, and because of the breach of lease and the unapproved content studio modifications, that deposit had been forfeited in full. Leonie looked at the empty desks, then at her husband's trembling hands, and asked the one question Beckett was terrified to answer. If your dad didn't have any money, she whispered, her eyes wide with a new terrifying greed, then whose millions was he looking at on his laptop? Every night I sat in Nashville, watching the sunset catch the light on Martha's ring, and felt the first of 1,000 desperate messages light up my screen. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The autopsy was complete, and the cause of death was terminal entitlement. I watched the city lights flicker to life and wondered how long it would take for them to realize that the family they thought they were managing was already cannibalizing itself in the Michigan. Dark. While my son was sifting through the wreckage of his ego in Michigan, I was sitting at a candlelit table in Nashville, watching his name flash on my screen like a distress signal from a ship I'd already watched sink. I was enjoying a high-end steak dinner at a place in the Gulch, the medium-rare ribeye sizzling and releasing an aroma of rich fat and rosemary that felt like the literal scent of freedom. My phone, resting face up on the white linen cloth, was vibrating with a rhythmic persistence. Beckett, Leanie, Vaughn, then Beckett again. I methodically sliced a piece of steak, chewed slowly, and read the snippets of texts without opening them. Dad, pick up. The bank says you canceled the overdraft protection. And we need to fix this now. That was the first. 10 minutes later, Conrad, honey. I know you're hurt, but the girls need the AC on. Please call. I almost laughed at Leonie's pivot back to honey. It was a masterclass in transparent manipulation. I realized then that they still hadn't figured out I was in another state. They were probably pacing the hallways of the Ann Arbor house looking for me in the garden or the basement. He's still threatening to talk in the morning, as if I were a naughty child hiding under the bed. A toxic family is like a pack of wolves. As long as there's a fresh kill, they're loyal. When the food runs out, they start looking at each other's throats. I took a sip of a bold Cabernet and felt a sense of stoic satisfaction. My absence was the only thing I'd ever given them that they actually felt. 500 miles away, the cannibalization of the Rhodes home was beginning in earnest. As the Michigan sun set, the power finally died. Without my secret manual payments to DTE Energy, the past due status I'd carefully cultivated hit the hard disconnect threshold. I imagined the house falling into a thick, suffocating darkness, the smell of unwashed laundry and uncollected trash becoming the new house brand. Have you ever wondered why the people who contribute the least always scream the loudest about what they're owed? Leanie and Beckett were currently living that reality. Based on the flood of notifications from the smart lock I hadn't yet relinquished, the finger-pointing had turned internal. They were screaming over who was responsible for the bills, and the rage quickly centered on Vaughn. He was the easy target, the useless drunk who had brought this bad luck into the house. I thought you were a consultant, Vaughn. Leonie's voice would be echoing off the walls. Where is the money you promised to bring in? Vaughn's response would be predictably venomous. Don't blame me. Your father is the one who sabotaged us. He's a snake. It was the sound of a house built on sand finally meeting the tide. I ordered dessert, a chocolate torte, and watched the lights of Nashville shimmer on the river. I had been the invisible current in their wires, the gravity they had forgotten existed, and now they were hitting the ground at terminal velocity. By Thursday morning, the foreclosure of respect was total. Leanie discovered that the SUV she used for her brand photos, the one she'd used to move my things to the curb, was registered to my LLC, and the insurance had been canceled on Monday. She was one traffic stop away from a total impound. In the dim flickering light of a dying flashlight, the marital alliance shattered. Everything we have is a lie. Beckett, I could almost hear her spitting. You're not a founder, you're a dependent. Beckett, desperate and cornered, would be clinging to his delusions. I was going to pay him back. I just needed more time. Take a look at your own front door. If you took your paycheck out of the equation today, who would still be standing on the other side of it tomorrow? I knew the answer for my son. I'd spent months documenting his slide, even finding receipts showing Leanie had been secretly donating my old clothes to a high-end consignment shop for cash. She'd been selling my literal skin while calling me a burden. I finished my meal, paid the bill, with a card that actually had funds, and stepped out into the humid Nashville night. The air was heavy, but I felt lighter than I had in 30 years. Friday evening brought the inevitable physical descent. Panic in the dark usually turns to aggression. Vaughn, suffering from the lack of air conditioning and his own dwindling stash of beer, tried to take the last $100 from the emergency jar on the mantel. He claimed senior priority and consulting fees owed. Beckett, fueled by the loss of his business and the literal darkness of his own life, finally snapped. He tried to wrestle the cash back from the man who had helped him bury me. A scuffle ensued in the living room, the sound of heavy boots thumping on the floorboards I had polished. They knocked over a lamp one Martha had loved, and I saw a brief heartbreaking clip on the mudroom camera before the battery died. Marigold was watching from the stairs, her small face pale in the shadows. The sound of Marigold's crying was the only thing that didn't feel like justice. "Get your hands off that money, you old parasite," Beckett roared. Vaughn swung a heavy glass bottle at Beckett's head, his face a mask of primal rage. "I'm family. You owe me for everything I've done for your brand," he screamed. Then the bottle shattered against the wall near Beckett's ear, and Vaughn let out a truth that stopped my son's heart. "She told me you were already dead," Conrad Vaughn screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization. "She told me you were terminally ill, and the house would be hers within the year. She told me we were just waiting for the body to catch up." I stood on my balcony, the phone silent in my hand, for the first time in days, and realized that my family hadn't just been waiting for me to leave. They had been rehearsing my funeral while I was still paying for the lights. I let the phone vibrate until the very last second, watching the Michigan area code dance on my mahogany nightstand, before I finally decided to let the silence end. The phone rang on Saturday morning, and for the first time in a week, I decided to let them hear my voice. Beckett's voice was unrecognizable, a jagged mess of hysteria and exhaustion that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "Dad? Oh God, Dad, please." He stammered the words, tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Vaughn tried to kill me. The house is dead, the lights are gone, the water. I don't know what to do. I've been calling you for days." I sat back in my chair looking out at the calm Nashville skyline, my expression as cold and unyielding as the stone. I didn't offer a word of comfort. I didn't ask if he was hurt. I simply waited for the silence to stretch long enough to make him realize that the old rules of our relationship had been incinerated. "If you want to talk, Beckett, you drive," I said, my voice a low clinical vibration. 9 hours, Tuesday 2 p.m., a diner called the Rusty Spur in Franklin, Tennessee. Bring Leanie and her father. Don't be late. He started to protest, mentioning gas money in the car, but I hung up. I had purposely chosen a diner that only accepts cash, knowing their cards were all declined, and they likely had to scrounge through the couch cushions just to fund the journey. Desperation is the only thing that travels faster than a lie, and I was going to make them feel every mile of it. I monitored their progress through the GPS tracker I knew was still on the SUV. I didn't need to see them to know the atmosphere inside that vehicle. I imagined the 9-hour purgatory of a 75, south the thick. Stifling heat of a Michigan summer without air conditioning because the engine's cooling fan was tied to a secondary belt I had stopped maintaining. I could almost smell the unwashed desperation and Vaughn's hungover rage stewing in the cramped cabin. I pictured the silence between Beckett and Leanie, a pair of predators who had finally run out of prey and were now looking at each other's throats. Is he actually going to help us? Or is this another trap Leanie would ask her curated voice now, sharp and desperate? He's my father, Leanie Beckett would reply, clinging to the last shred of his delusion. He has to. He's always been the safety net. How many miles of highway does it take to wash away 30 months of arrogance? Apparently 900 is the magic number. While they suffered through the humidity and the realization of their own powerlessness, I spent a quiet morning woodworking with Silas, reflecting on the difference between building a foundation and being one. Desperation is the only thing that travels faster than a lie, and they were currently breaking the speed limit. Tuesday arrived with a heavy southern heat that made the air in Franklin feel like a wet blanket. I arrived at the Rusty Spur at 1:30 p.m., taking a corner booth that gave me a clear view of the parking lot. Silas Whitaker sat beside me, his crisp suit and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the grease-stained menus and the smell of frying bacon. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. At exactly 1:58 p.m., a dusty, mud-streaked SUV with Michigan plates limped into the lot like a wounded animal. I watched through the window as the doors opened. Beckett emerged, first looking thinner and gray-faced, a visible white bandage taped crudely to his temple. Leanie followed, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained her hair, a bird's nest of neglected vanity. Finally, Vaughn Redmond climbed out limping heavily, and looking like a man who had aged a decade in a week. They looked exactly like the story they had tried to tell about, me broken, penniless, and discarded. The difference was Silas. They actually are what they look like, I whispered. They weren't just driving to Tennessee, they were driving to the end of their world, and I was the one waiting with the sunset. I saw the way Beckett's shoulders slumped as he looked at the diner's sign. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the ground he thought was solid was actually just the palm of my hand, and I had finally closed my fist. They walked toward the entrance with the hesitant, jerky movements of people entering a lion's den. I noticed the way Leanie clutched her empty designer bag, a hollow trophy of a life that had run out of credit. Beckett led his broken tribe through the door, the bell above the entrance chiming, with a cheerful mocking sound that seemed to make them all flinch. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on me, but the relief I expected to see on Beckett's face never materialized. Instead, his gaze shifted to the man sitting next to me. He recognized Silas instantly. He realized in that heartbeat that the investor he had been courting, the man he had insulted me to, was actually my right hand. I watched the true weight of terror settle into my son's bones, a physical transformation that turned his skin a sickly shade of ash. He realized that the blackout wasn't a glitch, and the eviction wasn't a mistake. It was a manifest I had been timing for years. The bell above the diner door chimed, and as Beckett led his broken tribe toward my booth, his eyes didn't land on me. They landed on Silas, and for the first time, I saw the true weight of terror settle into my son's bones. They stood at the edge of the table, smelling of road-weary sweat and failure, waiting for a greeting I had no intention of giving. I didn't point to the empty seats. I didn't offer them water. I simply reached into Silas's briefcase and pulled out the 31-page audit that would explain exactly how much their arrogance had cost them. The silence in the booth was absolute, broken only by the sound of Silas clicking his pen, ready to record the final reconciliation of the Rhodes estate. The booth felt smaller once they sat down, the smell of road-weary desperation, clashing with the crisp, expensive scent of Silas's cologne and the metallic tang of the truth I was about to exhale. I didn't offer a hand or a greeting. I sat with my back straight, watching Leanie try to adjust her wrinkled blouse and Beckett pull at the corners of the bandage on his head. Silas sat beside me, a clinical observer, with a briefcase that contained the shrapnel of their lives. I didn't offer menus. "I'm not here to talk, Beckett," I said, my voice dropping into a low frequency that commanded the air between us. "I'm here to reconcile the books." I reached into the briefcase and slid a heavy 31-page spiral-bound packet across the Formica table. The thud it made was heavy enough to make the salt shakers rattle. This was the formal audit of the last 30 months. A line-by-line accounting of every invisible dollar my son had claimed was a freeloading expense. Beckett tried to scoff his face, twisting into a mask of frantic denial, but Silas interceded with the cold authority of a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. "Sir, this document is a certified record of private loans and administrative costs," Silas said, his voice cutting through Beckett's stammer. "It has been notarized and prepared for legal filing. Have you ever seen a person's face change the exact second they realize they've accidentally burned a winning lottery ticket?" Beckett's eyes darted across the first few pages, his fingers trembling as he turned the sheets. "You told the neighbors I was a drain, Beckett. Page 12 shows the $156,000 I spent to keep your drain from overflowing." Leanie and Vaughn flipped through the pages with a growing, horrified fascination. I had included a section I called The Social Audit, and it featured high-resolution screenshots of their own texts mocking me and the photo I'd taken of the Goodbye Freeloader banner in its full hideous glory. I pointed out the specific line items for the $11,000 contract I had saved through my own consulting connections, and the utility bills I had paid while Vaughn was busy calling me a parasite on his front porch. The realization that I had been keeping score hit them like a physical weight, pinning them against the cracked vinyl of the booth. "Families don't keep score, Dad." Beckett shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate defensive rage that made heads turn in the diner. "You're being vindictive. You were supposed to help us." I leaned forward, my shadow falling over the audit. "Families don't, Beckett, but creditors do. And you've been living on credit for 3 years. Generosity is a gift. Accounting is a weapon." I was done giving gifts. I revealed then that the packet wasn't just for them. I had already BCC'd a digital copy to the board members of his remaining potential investors. His reputation as a self-made founder was being corrected in real time, replaced by the data of his actual dependency. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Vaughn's heavy, labored breathing. Silas didn't stop. He produced a second, much thinner folder, the net worth statement. This was the document that stripped away the final layer of their arrogance. He laid out the Detroit real estate holdings I'd quietly managed and the compounding growth of my 401k. I watched as Beckett's eyes scanned the bottom line, stopping on the figure that seemed to glow against the white paper, $4,217,000. The greed in the room became almost visible, a thick, greasy atmosphere that made me want to wash my hands. Leonie's posture changed instantly. The disgust she'd worn like a uniform for 30 months evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, desperate charm. She reached across the table, her fingers clawing toward my hand as she tried to force a smile. $4 million, Conrad? Honey, why didn't you tell us we were struggling for nothing? I pulled my hand back before she could touch me, the movement sharp and final. You weren't struggling, Leanie. You were spending. And the only thing nothing in this room is your respect for me. The $4 million sat between us like a glass wall. They could see it. They could want it. But they would break their hands before they ever touched a cent of it again. I watched her pupils dilate as she stared at the number, her mind already calculating how to pivot back into my good graces. I didn't give her the chance. I had spent 3 years being a ghost, and I was finally enjoying the solidity of my own power. As Leanie opened her mouth to offer a manufactured apology, I revealed the final structural collapse. The Nashville condo isn't an inheritance, Beckett. It is already deeded to a trust for Marigold that you will never have administrative rights to. And as for the Michigan house, Silas has already filed a civil suit to recoup the $156,000 from the proceeds of the sale. Leonie's fake smile faltered as I pulled the second folder back into Silas's briefcase, her eyes tracking the movement like a starving animal watching its last meal walk away. She looked at the empty seats, then at her husband's trembling hands, and finally back at me. Vaughn looked like he was about to have a stroke, his face a deep, unhealthy purple. They had come here expecting a bailout, a final signature to keep their lie alive. Instead, they had found an invoice they couldn't pay and a man they no longer recognized. I stood up, the silence in the booth so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of their lungs. The presentation was over. The audit was closed. I looked at Beckett, who was still staring at the word debtor on the final page of the packet. You wanted me out of your life because I was a burden? I said, my voice a final cold verdict. Yes, I'm just giving you exactly what you asked for. I turned toward the door, leaving them in the wreckage of their own greed smelling of cheap diner grease, and the sudden freezing realization that the safety net had become a noose. The silence in the booth was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of their lungs, a vacuum created by the sudden departure of every lie they had ever told themselves. I sat with my hands folded on the Formica table, watching the neon light from the diner sign catch the grease on Leanie's face. The arrogance that had fueled her for 30 months was gone, replaced by a frantic desperation. I spoke for the first time since the reveal, my voice a calm, low vibration that cut through her apologies. You didn't need a rich father, Beckett, I said, looking my son in his bloodshot eyes. You needed a father's love. I gave you both, and you only valued one until it was gone. I didn't hide the money to be cruel. I hid it to see if there was any love left that didn't have a price tag. But you showed me exactly who you were at that party. Every laugh at my expense, every insult on that banner was the final signature on your own disinheritance papers. I am not your safety net anymore, Beckett. I am just a man you used to know. There is no sound quite like the scream of a narcissist who's lost their audience, and I could see it building in Leonie's throat, a silent wail of missed millions. I reached into Silas's briefcase and produced a second envelope. I didn't slide it with the weight of the audit. I set it down lightly like a leaf falling on a grave. This is my only remaining contribution to your welfare, I stated. Inside, they found a list of professional resources, debt consolidators, tax attorneys, and a sheet of warehouse job listings in Ann Arbor. Beckett's hands shook as he looked at the names. Dad, please just a bridge loan. He begged, the words sounding like a death rattle. We're gonna lose everything. Vaughn Redmond finally found his voice, trying to use the only leverage he thought he had left. Your mother would be ashamed of this division. Conrad, he barked, his face a deep, unhealthy purple. Martha would be disgusted to see you treat your own blood this way. I touched the wedding ring on the chain beneath my shirt, feeling the cool, honest weight of the platinum. No Vaughn. Martha would be ashamed that her husband was humiliated by people who ate the food he paid for and slept in the beds he provided. She would be ashamed that our son values a brand more than a soul. That is the division. I realized then that their words had no power over me. I was no longer a resource to be harvested. I was a person they had discarded, and the ghost was finally finished haunting them. I leaned in closer, and the mid-twist of my plans settled over them. You think you're losing the house, Beckett, but you've already lost it. I didn't just let the debt fall to the bank. I bought the mortgage through an anonymous LLC months ago. Technically, I've been your landlord for the final 30 days of your eviction. Every time you walked past me in that hallway and called me a freeloader, you were standing on my property. Have you ever walked away from a fire you spent 3 years trying to put out, only to realize the warmth of the sunset feels better than the heat of the flames? I stood up, signaling Silas to follow. The air in the diner felt lighter already. I pulled 2 $20 bills from my wallet and laid them on the table. That covers the coffees and exactly 1 burger for Vaughn, I said. Consider it the final free meal you were so worried about. Behind me, the booth erupted into a frantic argument. They weren't fighting me anymore. They were turning on each other now that the target of their greed had left. Leanie was shrieking at Beckett about the failed startup, and Vaughn was already trying to grab the cash before the others could touch it. I walked toward the door, the bell above the entrance chiming with a cheerful finality. Don't call me Beckett, I said, without turning back. Don't email. When you can look me in the eye without a handout, we'll talk. Not before. I stepped into the fresh air of the Tennessee afternoon, feeling the phantom weight of 30 months finally lift from my shoulders. The Nashville humidity felt like a warm embrace, a contrast to the cold Michigan house I had left behind. They weren't my family anymore. They were just a bad investment I'd decided to write off. Silas and I walked toward his car, the sound of our shoes on the gravel, a rhythmic beat of progress. I paused and looked back toward the diner window. I could see them through the glass, a blurred triad of anger and desperation, still fighting over the scraps I'd left on the Formica. As I pulled away in the passenger seat of Silas's car, I saw the exit twist play out in the parking lot. Vaughn and Beckett were physically scuffling near the SUV, grappling over the $20 bill I'd left on the table. It was a pathetic low-stakes brawl that proved their bond was purely transactional. The family values Leanie had preached were nothing but a thin layer of paint on a rotted fence. I watched their figures shrink in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but dust on a Tennessee road, a fading memory of a life I no longer occupied. The smell of diesel exhaust from a passing truck filled the air, and the sun began its slow descent into a horizon of orange and deep purple. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires was the last thing I heard from that parking lot. My phone was silent now, no longer a distress signal, just a tool for a new life. The heavy Nashville humidity was cooling into an evening breeze as we headed toward the city lights. I felt a sense of ultimate catharsis, a logistics manager who had finally balanced the most difficult ledger of his life. But the real mystery started 2 weeks later, when Marigold called me from a number I didn't recognize her small voice, a reminder that some foundations are built on things money can never buy. I looked at the Tennessee sunset and realized that for the first time in years, the road ahead was perfectly clear. The first month of my new life in Nashville didn't feel like a retirement. It felt like a resurrection, a quiet rebuilding of a man who had spent too long as a ghost in his own hallway. I traded the heavy toxic humidity of Ann Arbor for the cool metallic taste of the Nashville evening air. My new condo in the Gulch sat high above the city, offering a vantage point that matched my new mental clarity. I spent my mornings watching the Cumberland River rush below my balcony, a relentless flow of energy that reminded me that life doesn't stop just because a few parasites fall off the hull. I was finally at peace, or as close to it as a man with my history can get, until a video call from an unknown number broke the silence in mid-October. I tapped the screen, and the grainy pixelated face of Marigold appeared. She was huddled in what looked like a backyard shed, clutching a tablet. Grandpa misses. Henderson let me use her screen, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why did you leave? The house is so dark and Mommy and Daddy won't stop screaming. My heart broke for that child, a physical ache that almost made me reach for my car keys. But I knew the neighbor misses. Henderson wasn't just a kind bystander. She was a private investigator I had hired weeks ago to ensure Marigold's physical safety while the household caved in. I had to remain a distance away to ensure the lesson for Beckett was permanent. I didn't leave you, sweetheart, I said, keeping my voice a steady anchor for her. I just had to go build a place where the truth lives. I will see you soon, I promise. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries, and mine were finally ironclad. In November, I met with Silas at his satellite office near Music Row to finalize the legal architecture of my new purpose. The office smelled of expensive leather and the crisp, clean texture of new legal documents. We weren't just managing my wealth anymore. We were weaponizing it. I want this fund to be Martha's legacy, I told Silas as I signed the final allocation papers. She always hated a bully, and she spent her life protecting people. The wife's elder protection fund was born that afternoon, fueled by a significant portion of my Detroit real estate profits. It was designed to provide a legal shield for seniors facing the same financial abuse I had endured. I realized that my 30 months of suffering had given me a specific set of skills that the world desperately needed. I also instructed Silas to lock Marigold's trust behind a 25-year maturity clause. It's done, Conrad Silas replied, his eyes reflecting the professional respect Beckett had never offered. The trust is ironclad. Your son could sue for a century and never see a dime of her future. How many of you have a Marigold in your life, someone you'd burn the world for? Even if the world is currently being run by people you despise, I was burning the old world to make sure hers was built on stone instead of sand. By December, I had established a routine that felt like wearing a suit that actually fit. I started a small-scale consulting firm for local freight companies, and I quickly found that in Tennessee, my 40 years of logistics expertise was valued by people who actually paid their bills on time. I enjoyed my evenings walking through Riverfront Park, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. It's amazing how much energy you have when you aren't carrying a 300-pound lie every day. I was no longer the invisible current in someone else's wires. I was the generator. One evening, while sitting on a bench near the water, my phone buzzed with a final text from Leanie. It was a long, rambling, groveling apology filled with promises of change and mentions of family values. I didn't even read past the first paragraph. I deleted the thread and blocked the number, finally closing the door on the toxicity. "Goodbye, Leanie," I whispered to the breeze. "I hope the retail life suits your brand." Nashville wasn't just a city. It was a clean sheet of paper. And I was finally holding the pen. I touched Martha's ring on the chain around my neck, feeling the cool platinum, and realized that for the first time in a decade, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one deciding where the feet went. I spent my days in a state of serene liberation, watching my new consulting firm grow through word of mouth rather than manufactured social media hype. I discovered a news clip from a local Michigan affiliate that Silas sent me. Vaughn Redmond had attempted to sue me for emotional distress, claiming my sudden abandonment had caused him medical trauma. The case was dismissed before it even reached a judge because the lawyer Vaughn tried to hire was a beneficiary of my new protection fund and had immediately flagged the case as frivolous. The irony was a vintage I enjoyed thoroughly. My legacy was no longer a target. It was a fortress. I looked out at the Nashville skyline, the cranes and glass towers a testament to growth and resilience, and I felt a sense of completion. I had balanced the ledger. I had protected the innocent. I had survived the earthquake I created. I was finally at peace until a handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox 3 days before Christmas. Not from Leanie and not from the bank, but from the son I thought I'd buried in the Tennessee dust. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, slanted, arrogant, and reaching out for a ghost. I stood in my foyer, the letter heavy in my hand, and realized that some ghosts refuse to stay in the graveyard, especially when they think there's still a vault left to crack. I walked to my balcony, looking out at the river, one last time, before opening the seal, knowing that the piece I'd built was about to face its final, most dangerous test. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, slanted, arrogant, and reaching out for a ghost that no longer existed to pay for a life that had finally run out of credit. I stood on my balcony in the crisp December air, the paper feeling heavy in my hand, despite its physical lightness. Beckett's 2-page letter was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a script written for a father who was supposed to be soft and nostalgic. He claimed he had finally divorced Leanie, cut off Vaughn's parasitic influence, and realized that I was the only true north he ever had. I sat down and read it twice, my logistics mind immediately flagging the calculated emotional beats. He used the word legacy 4 times. He mentioned Martha's favorite holiday tradition. He spoke of Marigold's need for a stable family. But I had already asked Silas to run a background check 48 hours before the mail arrived. The data didn't lie. Beckett and Leanie were not divorced. They were currently living in a cramped apartment in Ann Arbor, and the split was a coordinated ruse designed to get me to open my checkbook one last time. "It is a beautiful apology, Beckett," I whispered to the empty room. "It is just 5 years too late." Despite the betrayal, I decided to grant him a final audience in a public Nashville coffee shop. I didn't do it out of hope, but to provide the definitive face-to-face closure that a shadow deserves before it is finally erased. A shark can smell blood from a mile away. A narcissist can smell a second chance from 1,000. I arrived at the shop early, the smell of burnt espresso and expensive winter wool filling the narrow space. Beckett arrived 10 minutes late, a tactical move to make me anxious that failed the moment he saw my stone-faced expression. He looked thinner, his hair unkempt, performing the role of the broken man seeking redemption with practiced precision. For 30 minutes, I let him speak. I watched him describe his regrets, his supposed growth, and his desire to rebuild our relationship for Marigold's sake. I sat in silence, my fingers feeling the texture of the wooden table as I watched his eyes for the pivot. In logistics, the pivot is the moment the cargo changes direction. In a con, it's the moment the conversation shifts from love to leverage. It finally happened when his voice dropped an octave, becoming conspiratorial. "I don't want your money, Dad," he said, his eyes darting toward my coat pocket. "I just want my father back. but I found this miracle business opportunity, a tech logistics merger that just needs a stable name attached to the guarantee. I looked at him, the disgust rising in my throat like bile. Then why is there a loan application for $50,000 in your coat pocket? I asked, the sound of my voice cutting through his performance like a bone-handled knife. How many times can you watch a person perform the same lie before the theater becomes more exhausting than the truth? Beckett froze, his hand instinctively twitching toward his chest. The mask didn't just slip. It evaporated, replaced by the same raw entitlement that had fueled the birthday party banner. The humility was gone, replaced by a sneer I had seen too many times. "You're hoarding your millions while your own son suffers," he hissed, his voice loud enough to make a woman at the next table flinch. "You're going to let your own flesh and blood rot for a grudge?" I didn't respond with anger. I stood up slowly, reaching into my wallet to pull out the price of my coffee. I placed the bills on the table with a rhythmic tap of my finger. "It is not a grudge, Beckett. It is an invoice, and you are all out of ways to pay it. You didn't come here for a father. You came here for a signature, and I am finished being your pen." The coffee was hot, but the air between us was absolute zero. It was the temperature where all motion stops, including my hope for him. I had spent 40 years ensuring things reached their destination, and I had finally delivered my son to the only place he belonged, the consequences of his own character. I turned toward the door, my hand closing around the cold brass handle. Beckett's voice followed me, a desperate, ugly scream that echoed off the brick walls of the coffee shop. "You're a monster. You're just like they said you were." I didn't turn back. I stepped out onto the Nashville street, the midday sun, reflecting off the glass towers. I felt a sense of absolute finality, a liberation that I hadn't felt since the day I drove across the Michigan border. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a notification from Silas. The $50,000 loan Beckett was so desperate to secure wasn't even for a business venture. It was to pay off a private investigator he had hired to find my offshore accounts, a man who ironically was already on my payroll as part of the protection fund network. My son was paying to find a vault that I had already emptied and moved into a fortress he could never breach. I left him screaming at my back in the middle of Broadway, but I didn't feel the sting anymore. All I felt was the weight of the digital file I'd just authorized Silas to release to the trust I'd built for the girls. That file contained the truth of every dollar spent, every lie told, and every debt owed. It was their inheritance, the only one I would ever allow them to have. I reached my car and sat for a moment in the silence, the rhythmic beating of my own heart, the only sound in the cabin. I was no longer a ghost, and I was no longer a foundation. I was a man who had finally learned the value of his own silence. I looked at the city ahead of me and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. Time is the only asset a logistics man can't manufacture. But by July 2025, I realized I'd finally learned how to spend it on a life that didn't require me to be anyone's invisible floor. My new world in Nashville has a different weight to it, a solidity that isn't dependent on the whims of ungrateful children or the curated lies of a social media profile. I spend my mornings in my condo in the Gulch, watching the Nashville sun climb over the skyline while the smell of cedar wood and a fresh southern rain drifts through the open balcony doors. My consulting firm is a quiet success built on 40 years of genuine expertise. My clients are people who value my time, and more importantly, people who actually pay their bills. I work 20 hours a week because I choose to, not because I am frantically topping off someone else's leaking bucket. I have never been healthier, and I have never been more certain of the ground beneath my feet. Once a week, I meet Silas Whitaker for dinner. He has become the son I should have raised, a man of integrity, who understands that a legacy isn't something you inherit by force. It is something you earn through discipline. "You are more than a client, Conrad," he told me last Tuesday over a glass of bourbon. "You are the foundation of everything I've built." I smiled, feeling a rare sense of validation. It is nice to be the foundation for someone who actually knows how to build on top of it, Silas. The digital file I released to the girls' trust wasn't just a ledger of debts, though. That was included. The real core was a video I had kept hidden for years, Martha speaking directly to her granddaughters. She spoke about self-worth, about the danger of letting people define your value, and about the importance of truth. I bypassed Leanie's influence from beyond the grave, ensuring my wife's voice would be the one they heard when they finally came of age. People who call you selfish for setting boundaries are usually the ones who benefited from you having none. I realize this more than ever as I watch the final reports from Michigan come in. Beckett is currently working a humble warehouse job, a position I actually provided a factual professional reference for. It was my final act of boundaries, not bitterness. He is finally learning what a paycheck is worth when it isn't subsidized by a freeloader. Leanie is divorced and working in retail, her influencer dreams having collapsed alongside the credit I provided. Vaughn Redman has retreated to Florida, likely looking for a new vault to crack. The house in Ann Arbor is gone, the lies are exposed, and the wife's elder protection fund has already helped nearly 50 families escape the kind of silent abuse I endured. I am no longer a victim of their narrative. I am the architect of their education. If you stopped holding everything together, today would your world stand on its own? Or would it realize it never had legs in the first place? That was the question my son had to answer in the dark of that Michigan winter. I didn't destroy his life. I simply stopped pretending I wasn't the one keeping it upright. Back in Nashville, I keep a polished wooden jewelry box on my dresser, the smooth texture a comfort to my touch. It holds the few things that matter: Martha's journals, my father's watch, and the platinum ring. I've recently purchased an empty lot next to the warehouse where Beckett works through the protection fund to build a community park for children. I want to remain a guardian of the innocent without ever having to speak to the guilty again. I am standing on the shore now, watching the tide finally come in for a man who spent too long holding back the sea. My absence was the gravity they had forgotten existed, and gravity always has the final word. I wasn't standing over the wreckage. I was standing on a new foundation, one built on the truth I had finally stopped hiding. As the sun began its slow descent over the Cumberland River, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and violet, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from Marigold. Her genuine happy laughter filled the room as she showed me an A on her math test. "Grandpa, did you see I did it?" She chirped, her eyes bright with a pride that wasn't bought. "I did see, sweetheart," I replied, my voice thick with a different kind of emotion. "I am so proud of you. Remember what we talked about. The numbers never lie if you're the one doing the work." I promised her I'd see her soon, and I meant it. Her future is a fortress that Beckett and Leanie will never be able to storm. I ended the call and stepped out onto the balcony, the evening breeze cooling the Nashville air. I reached into my pocket and touched the platinum ring on its chain, then held it up to catch the dying light. I was never the freeloader, I whispered to the horizon. I was the foundation. And when I left, everything built on me collapsed. That wasn't revenge, that was gravity. Wife's ring is safe. Granddaughter's future is secure. Me, I am finally living the life I earned. I watched the Nashville sun dip below the horizon, the platinum of Martha's ring, catching the last light of a day that belonged entirely to me. The city below began to glow 1,000 lights, fueled by a current I no longer had to manage for anyone but myself. I thought back to the birthday party, to the banner, and to the hot dogs smeared across a rental car. Those moments felt like they belonged to a different man in a different century. I sat in my chair feeling the weight of 62 years finally balance out. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my peace. I closed my eyes and listened to the river, a logistics manager who had finally delivered his most important cargo himself. For the first time in my life, the road ahead was perfectly clear, and the only person I had to answer to was the man in the mirror. I was no longer a ghost. I was the master of my own silence, and the silence was beautiful. I used to believe silence was loyalty. I thought enduring everything was what a father was supposed to do. But looking back, I see the truth clearly. Now, my biggest mistake wasn't trusting my family, it was abandoning myself. That is how family betrayal takes root, not in one moment, but in years of quiet permission. This family story is not about revenge. It's about boundaries I should have drawn long ago. If you are listening to me now, don't become the invisible foundation for people who only remember you when they need support. Love does not mean erasing yourself. Even faith teaches us that truth matters. God did not create you to be used, but to stand with dignity. I learned that too late after family betrayal turned my home into a stage and my silence into their weapon. Let this family story remind you, kindness without limits becomes permission for abuse. I still believe in forgiveness, but forgiveness does not mean access. I walked away not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally chose to respect myself. And if there is one lesson in this family story, it is this: never trade your worth just to keep the peace. Because peace built on lies will always collapse into family betrayal. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in a situation where your own family publicly turned against you? I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A small note: while inspired by real-life emotional conflicts within families, some elements were dramatized for storytelling. If this isn't your kind of content, feel free to explore something that suits you better.